I was there, deep in the forests of Vietnam, where every step may be the last. Between deadly traps and merciless ambushes, I lived an unforgettable hell. But even after surviving the battles, the war was not over for me. What awaits me now was that hell just the beginning of something worse. Episode 1. Before we start, I advise you to listen to the story before bedtime, put on headphones, turn off the lights, close your eyes, and then immerse yourself in the story. If you are interested in enjoying people's stories, then this channel is for you. So if you are interested, explore a lot of exciting stories and subscribe to the Northern Stories channel to settle on new, more fascinating stories. Let's go. My name is Jonathan Miller. I was born in the suburbs of Chicago in 1943. I grew up in a middle-class family, and my father worked in a small grocery store he owned in the neighborhood. I spent my childhood and youth in this quiet neighborhood, where our lives were simple and routine. I was never one of those people who sought adventures or looked for excitement. I envisioned my future managing the family store, marrying a nice girl, and living a stable life. But fate had something completely different in store for me. In 1967, after I finished high school, I started working with my father in the store. I didn't have big aspirations. I was content with my simple life. I had a few friends in the neighborhood, and we spent time together after work, talking about everyday matters and enjoying the little things in life. I wasn't closely following political news, and I didn't care about the conflicts happening in the world at that time. But one day, everything changed. I received a draft notice from the army, and that letter was a shock to me. I never imagined that I would be called to fight in a war I knew nothing about. At first, I tried to resist the idea. I tried to talk to my family to find a way out of this predicament, but I soon realized that it was beyond my control. The draft was mandatory, and I had no choice but to comply. Within a few weeks, I found myself at a training camp in Fort Benning, Georgia. The place was a mix of harsh heat, high humidity, and psychological pressure. When I arrived, everything felt strange and unfamiliar. The place was bustling with soldiers being trained to fight in harsh conditions. I was one of hundreds of young men who had just been drafted, and we all shared the same feelings, anxiety and fear of the unknown. The first day in the camp was exhausting, not only physically but also mentally. We were divided into small groups and began receiving basic training. We woke up at 5 in the morning and started the day with strenuous exercises. Long-distance running, climbing, and swimming were part of the daily routine. We knew that this training aimed to make us stronger and tougher, but I felt that my body had reached its limits. The training also included learning to use weapons, from rifles to hand grenades. I was not accustomed to handling weapons, and I was intimidated by them. But the instructors were strict, and there was no room for error. We were learning quickly because we had no other choice. We were racing against time, and we knew that every skill we learned could be the difference between life and death when we reached Vietnam. Another part of the training involved recognizing the traps that the Viet Cong frequently used. They explained to us how these traps were designed to be almost invisible, and that they were planted in strategic locations to ensnare as many American soldiers as possible. We trained to detect and avoid them, but it was not easy. They warned us repeatedly that these traps could be everywhere, and the slightest mistake could be fatal. There were also survival training exercises in the jungle, where we learned how to move silently and how to adapt to harsh conditions. We trained on using maps and compasses, and on dealing with insects and high temperatures. The jungles in Vietnam were an inhospitable place, and we had to be prepared for anything. As the weeks went by, I began to feel like a soldier, but I still felt afraid of the future. As the date of our departure to Vietnam approached, anxiety increased. We heard terrifying stories about the war there, and about soldiers who never returned. Those stories lingered in my mind all the time, heightening my sense of dread. Finally, the day we all feared arrived, the day of our departure to Vietnam. On a sunny August morning, We were gathered in the campyard, where we boarded the military planes that would take us there. The flight to Vietnam was long and exhausting. We sat in the plane, each of us lost in our thoughts. There wasn't much conversation among us. All discussions felt trivial in light of the horror that awaited us. When the plane arrived in Saigon, the heat and humidity were the first things to shock us. The atmosphere was stifling, as if you had stepped into an oven. The soldiers who greeted us looked pale and exhausted, and there was a look in their eyes that I didn't understand at first, but it was filled with fatigue and fear that didn't fade over time. When I saw them, I realized that I had entered a completely different world. We were transported to a nearby military base, where we began to acclimate to life in Vietnam. We were trying to adjust to the heat and humidity, but it was extremely difficult. Everything seemed strange and frightening. The sounds at night were different. There was always the buzzing of insects, the creaking of the wind through the trees, and other sounds whose sources I couldn't identify. The jungle surrounded us on all sides, and there was a constant feeling that we were being watched. On the first day, we didn't know what to expect. We woke up early in the morning to the sounds of military alarms, and we gathered in the courtyard to receive orders. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, and everyone was trying to hide their tension. We were divided into small groups, and each group was assigned a specific mission. My first task was to participate in a reconnaissance patrol in one of the areas surrounding the base. We moved slowly and cautiously, avoiding any movement that might reveal our presence. We carried our weapons as if they were part of our bodies, ready for anything. The jungle was dense and tangled, and every bush and tree trunk seemed to conceal a danger. We knew that the Viet Cong used this jungle to their advantage and that they knew it as well as the backs of their hands. Therefore, we advanced with great caution, listening to every sound, watching every movement. At noon, we felt unusual movement in the trees. We all stopped, fingers on the triggers of our rifles. The moments that followed were filled with tension. Then suddenly, bullets fired from somewhere, hitting the ground around us. Those were the first moments I faced gunfire directly. We couldn't see the enemy, and we didn't know where the bullets were coming from. All we were doing was looking for cover and shooting in the directions we thought the enemy was hiding. The skirmish didn't last long, but it was enough to instill fear in our hearts. After the skirmish ended, we discovered that we were lucky. None of us was injured. But I realized that this was just a simple test of what awaited us in the days to come. On the second day, we were assigned a mission to secure an area that had been used by American forces as an observation point. We had to move carefully, knowing that the Viet Cong might have planted traps in that area. We walked slowly, each of us watching the ground with extreme care, trying to spot any signs of traps. In an unexpected moment, one of our comrades fell into a trap. The trap was a carefully covered pit, and when he stepped on it, his foot slipped inside. The cry of pain he let out tore through the silence we were experiencing. We ran towards him quickly, trying to help. The trap was filled with sharp wooden stakes that pierced his legs. We struggled to pull him out, and the pain was evident on his face. We did what we could to provide first aid, but we knew his condition was serious, and he needed to be transported to the field hospital as soon as possible. I woke up on the third day to the sound of a whistle signaling us to gather for the next mission. The sun had barely risen, but the heat and humidity were already unbearable. I was still exhausted from the events of the past 2 days, but there was no time for rest or reflection. The orders were clear, and we had to move quickly. I woke up on the third day to the sound of a whistle signaling us to gather for the next mission. The sun had barely risen, but the heat and humidity were already unbearable. I was still exhausted from the events of the past 2 days, but there was no time for rest or reflection. The orders were clear, and we had to move quickly. Our unit was assigned a new mission, to comb an area suspected of containing Viet Cong hideouts. This was different from previous missions. This time we were heading toward an area that could contain a large number of enemy soldiers. We moved in tight formation through the dense jungle, weapons ready for use at any moment. Silence enveloped us, with only the sound of our feet crushing the fallen leaves beneath us. After hours of cautious advancement, the jungle began to thicken. The trees were intertwined in a way that made visibility difficult, as if we were entering a maze. We were well aware that at any moment the situation could change, and we were ready to fight. Suddenly, we heard movement at the front of the line, followed by the sound of a deafening explosion. Our feet stopped immediately, and our eyes began to scan quickly for the source of danger. A landmine had exploded beneath the feet of one of the soldiers at the front. The scene was horrific. The soldier fell to the ground, and blood was splattering in the air. There was no time to think. We started firing in every possible direction of the attack. It dawned on us then that we had fallen into an ambush. Gunfire erupted from among the trees. We could see nothing but the flashes between the dense branches. Everyone tried to scatter and find cover, but the area did not offer much protection. The sound of gunfire was deafening, and each of us was trying to stay alive. In those moments, the only thought running through my mind was, "Will I be able to survive?" Time passed very slowly, but eventually, we managed to return fire and called for air support. The helicopters arrived and began firing at the locations where we believed the Viet Cong were hiding. After a few minutes, the sound of gunfire gradually diminished until silence reigned again. When the skirmish ended, I began to survey the area around me. The scene was dreadful. Soldiers from our unit were injured, some of them never moving. It was hard to accept what had happened in those moments, but we had no choice but to move forward. We gathered the wounded and sent them to the rear base for treatment. There was a soldier from our unit named Sam, who had lost his leg in the explosion. I looked into his eyes as he was being carried to the helicopter, and I saw a mix of pain and terror in them, but I also saw a look of resignation, as if he knew that the war had taken something from him that he would never be able to regain. After the mission ended, we were informed to return to base. The road was long, and we walked with heavy steps, burdened by shock and exhaustion. When we arrived at the base, we looked as if we had been through hell, and the looks in the eyes of the other soldiers at the base reflected the magnitude of the horror we had witnessed. That night, I was sitting in my tent, trying to comprehend what had happened. Images flooded my mind incessantly: the explosion of the mine, the soldiers' screams, and the blood that covered the ground. I couldn't sleep, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw those scenes replaying before me as if they were scenes from an endless nightmare. I wasn't the only one suffering. I could hear the voices of my comrades speaking in hushed tones, as if they were trying to banish the memories of the day away. In those moments, I began to understand the gravity of our situation. We weren't fighting a regular army. We were battling an enemy that knew these jungles as well as it knew itself. The Viet Cong appeared and disappeared like ghosts, using nature to their advantage in ways we couldn't imagine. I realized that each day could be our last, and that we were trapped in a cruel game, where death could come at any moment, from any direction. On the fourth day, we woke to the sound of the alarm as usual, but there was a different feeling among us. We carried in our hearts the weight of the events we had gone through, and everyone spoke in low voices. The orders were clear. We would be sweeping a new area that had not yet been subjected to any search operations. We moved in small groups again, and I felt that every step I took could be the last. We were walking through the dense jungle, and the ground beneath us was muddy from the rain that had fallen the night before. Caution dominated every movement, and there was no room for error. In the middle of the road, I saw a colleague of ours named Tom suddenly stop, his eyes fixed on something in front of him. I cautiously approached to see what had caught his attention, and what I saw before me was a new trap. It was a pit covered with branches and leaves, but inside it were terrifyingly sharp bamboo stakes. It was clear that if Tom hadn't noticed that trap, he would now be among the dead. We carefully bypassed the trap and continued to move forward. We didn't know how long we had spent in those jungles, but when we emerged from them, the day had begun to wane. We were exhausted and hungry, but we couldn't take a break. Orders kept coming, and we had to keep advancing. When we returned to base at the end of the day, everyone was in a state of complete fatigue. We sat together, eating in silence, each of us reflecting on the day we had gone through. We realized that things would not get easier. Episode 2? Available in the channel.